If you would like to read through the whole Bible, today's video will help. Many Christians find it hard to read through the Old Testament because it's much bigger than the New. One of the best strategies to read through it is to copy something Jesus did. Jesus said several times in the Gospels, the Old Testament spoke about him. On one occasion in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus walked to a city with two of his disciples, and as he walked with them, he walked them through the Old Testament. But as he did this, he showed them how it all pointed to him. They would never read their Old Testament scriptures the same way again. And it's the same thing that will happen to you when you do the same. One of the questions I think about when reading through the Old Testament is, how is this about Jesus? So in today's video, I'm going to use Joseph in Genesis as an example. You are going to discover 7 ways Joseph's story is really pointing to Jesus. But no, there are things like this in every book in the Old Testament. The first way in which Joseph's story points to Jesus is a good one. Joseph was one of Jacob's 12 sons. This is the same Jacob that God changes his name to Israel. Jacob didn't hide that Joseph was his favorite. Jacob wanted to show everyone that Joseph was his favorite son. One way he did this was by giving him a special coat, a coat that made him the clear number one to everyone who saw it. It's like when someone gets Employee of the Month, only it's not for 1 month, but ongoing. It says in Genesis 37 verse 3, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors." This part of Joseph's story helps us understand in the true and right way how Jesus is the beloved of his Father. There is no one like him. He's unique. Jesus is the only begotten. It's not like Jesus is one of several like Joseph. He is the only one. Jesus is greater than all Old Testament examples. The second way Joseph's story points us to Jesus is about what happened with his special robe. You just saw how this coat pointed to his prime position, but as you read through Joseph's story, he loses the coat. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But then, when he gets promoted by Pharaoh, the Bible tells us something subtle but powerful. In Genesis 41 verse 42 it says, "And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck." Pharaoh puts Joseph in great clothing. He had the position, he lost it, and then regained it. And this is exactly what Jesus illustrated in a simple but great way in John 13. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet during the Last Supper, John shares something subtle but breathtaking. Jesus stood up, took off his garment, washed his disciples' feet, and then put his clothes on and sat down again. The Gospels tell us Jesus was wearing a very expensive and high quality garment, just like Joseph was. This is why the Roman soldiers gambled for it instead of ripping it. But what Jesus did showed us exactly what happened to Joseph. But what Jesus did was in an even greater way. He was God. He lowered himself and became a servant. He washed the disciples' feet and then went back to where he was before. Joseph didn't plan what happened to him, but Jesus did. The third way Joseph points to Jesus is how his brothers betrayed him. Joseph's brothers didn't like the special treatment he got from Jacob, and they hated the fact he had dreams that showed he would reign over them. For them, those dreams were a smack in the face, icing on the cake that he was above them. But they conjure up this plan to kill Joseph, and they even say, if we kill him, we will see then what becomes of his dreams. In the end though, they decide that selling him is the better thing to do. After all, he is their brother. It's the same thing that happens with Jesus. He's not betrayed by the Romans. It was some of his own people who betrayed him. The Gospels do tell us that his actual brothers didn't believe him at first too, but it was the leaders who betrayed him to the Romans. The fourth way Joseph's story points to Jesus is that both were sold for silver. Joseph's brothers throw him in a pit, and then when these traders pass by, the brothers sell Joseph to them for 20 pieces of silver. Then they take the coat off Joseph so they can put animal blood on it and give it to Jacob. This way he will believe Joseph is dead. So they sell him and live as if he's dead for like 20 years. In like fashion, Judas has a secret meeting with the religious leaders behind the disciples' backs. He promises them he will set Jesus up to make it easy to get him. Judas agrees to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. It's not 20 pieces like Joseph, but the symmetry is clear. The fifth way that Joseph's story points to Jesus is that both lived in Egypt. This isn't the biggest comparison until you realize this is the only time the Gospels tell us that Jesus left the country. Joseph was sold, as I just said, and the tradesmen took him to Egypt. There he sold to a man named Potiphar and works in his house. For Jesus, it was as a baby to avoid King Herod killing him. If you know anything about Herod, he was a madman and very paranoid. So, out of fear of being replaced as the king, he sends commands to execute all the babies in Bethlehem. Both find themselves in Egypt at some point in their lives. The sixth way Joseph's story points to Jesus is that both were dead to their people, but were blessing the Gentiles until... What does that mean, Israel? Let me make this very simple. I mentioned earlier in the video, Joseph's brothers took his coat and they dipped it in animal blood, and then Jacob sees the coat and concludes Joseph is dead. So although his brothers know he's not dead, they all live as if Joseph is dead. During this time for Jacob's family, to all the Israelites, Joseph is dead. But he's actually blessing the Egyptians and in turn the whole world, because Egypt was ruling the world then. In the same way, with Jesus in a greater way, Jesus was crucified, betrayed by his brothers, the Israelites, but they in large part rejected him. But in that period, Jesus has been a blessing to Jews, yes, but in large part to the Gentile world. But it's not forever. Just as Joseph was dead to the Israelites until they saw him years later, it's the same for Jesus. Jesus is blessing the Gentile world until the Bible says the fullness of the Gentiles are come in. The Jews will acknowledge their Messiah after many years of rejecting him. Joseph saved the world as an example of how Jesus, in the ultimate sense, will save the world. Before I give you a bonus, the seventh way that Joseph's story points to Jesus is that both suffered, but it turned out for the good of those who betrayed him. Joseph says it clearly at the end of Genesis. In Genesis 50 verse 20 it says, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." And Peter in his preaching in Acts says the same thing about Jesus. In Acts chapter 4, verses 27 to 28, it says, "For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together, for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. They did evil, but God's plan was for much good to come from it. And when Pharaoh promoted Joseph and gave him those special clothes, he also gave him a Gentile bride. Joseph married an Egyptian. In the same way, Christ has a Gentile bride, the church." This is one part of the first book in the Bible. But imagine when you are reading through every book in the Old Testament and seeing things like this. They are there and waiting for you to discover. If you like this video and want me to do more like this, let me know. But until next time, God bless.